Good evening. I'd like to welcome everybody here tonight, and we thank you for coming out on kind of a cold night, but I think you'll be thoroughly enjoyed. You're going to enjoy tonight as we get a chance to hear from somebody that knew Gordon Rosenmeier really well. I'm Eric Klang. I'm the president of our board for the Gordon Rosenmeier board. And on behalf of the board, we'd like to welcome you guys all for coming out tonight. Without further ado, I would like to introduce our executive director, Steve Wenzel, to come up to introduce our guest. And I think we'll have some questions afterwards. So if you have questions or you think of some, we'll get a chance to answer some of those questions, and we'll go around with the mic. Steve? Thanks.
I deem it a high honor to introduce to you tonight as the keynote speaker of our Rosenmeier Forum, Mr. Stephen Dornfeld. Tonight's forum, entitled Gordon Rosenmeier, a Legislative Legend, brings to us the most experienced and qualified person, in my opinion, to speak about Gordon's legislative career and legacy. Steve Dornfeld is a seasoned and veteran reporter and journalist on Minnesota politics and government. Mr. Dornfeld worked at the Minneapolis Tribune as its state capitol reporter and also served at the St. Paul Pioneer Press as a Washington correspondent and also as editorial page editor. Several years ago, Steve was awarded a Walter F. Mondale Research Fellowship from the University of Minnesota. From this award, he researched Gordon's legislative career and authored an extensive article that appeared in the Minnesota History magazine, published by the Minnesota Historical Society. When I represented Morrison and Crow Wing counties in the Minnesota House of Representatives, I came to respect and admire Mr. Dornfeld's excellent coverage of state government. It was also my privilege to personally know Gordon Rosenmeier, and I had many visits with Gordon on issues relating to state government. Senator Rosenmeier is regarded by legislative historians as the single most influential and powerful legislator in all of Minnesota history. And so, with no further ado, it is my privilege to introduce to you Mr. Steve Dornfeld and to welcome him to our Rosenmeier Forum.
Good evening. I really appreciate the opportunity to be with you here tonight. And I appreciate that wonderful introduction by Steve. Did you notice that he described me as seasoned? I think that's a polite way of saying old. And I probably resemble that remark. In the early and mid-'70s, I had the opportunity on a number of occasions to cover the late Vice President Hubert Humphrey. Then a little later on in that decade, I found myself covering his son Skip Humphrey during his years as a legislator and attorney general. Well, when I got to the point that I found myself interviewing his grandson, Buck, I figured maybe I've been doing this too long. I started covering the state capitol in 1971, which was the year after Gordon Rosenmeier was defeated. But I'd heard a number of stories about him, and I had the opportunity to meet him several times. My most vivid memory was bumping into Gordon in a St. Paul bar one night during the early stages of Watergate. And I don't know if he described the Watergate break-in as a third-rate burglary or not. I don't remember that detail. But he was fairly dismissive of the whole thing. I felt otherwise. But I was a 25-year-old kid reporter, and he was this preeminent lawyer legislator, and I didn't feel like I was on very solid ground to argue with him. The idea of writing an article about him was kind of in the back of my mind during my whole career. As I say, I heard a lot of stories about Gordon, and I saw evidence of his good work in our state laws. And finally, the opportunity presented itself after I retired. And as Steve mentioned, I won a nice research grant from the University of Minnesota to help fund my research. And the editor of Minnesota History Magazine was very receptive to the idea. So everything came together at a wonderful time. For those of you who may be interested, I was going to just briefly touch on the research itself. Gordon donated 25 boxes of his papers to the Minnesota History Center in St. Paul. 10 of those boxes were about his legal practice, so I ignored those. I didn't have time to sift through those, but I focused very heavily on the other 15 boxes on his legislative career, and it was just a treasure trove with lots of letters, copies of bills, newspaper clippings, and a number of oral interviews that were done with him. So I had a lot of original material to work with. And unfortunately, I only had 5,000 words of space in the magazine. So it's a little bit of like that proverbial trying to fit 10 pounds of potatoes into a 5-pound bag. I did the best that I could. I also paid visits to the State Legislative Reference Library in St. Paul, the Morrison County Historical Society, and the Rosenmeier home in Little Falls. And the staff at all of those facilities were just enormously helpful. After this project, some of my favorite people in the world are librarians. Finally, I conducted interviews with about 20 people who knew him personally. And it was rather amazing when you think about it. He served in the Senate from 1940 until 1970. And there were still people around, that many people around who had dealt with him personally. One that sticks in my mind because it happened so early in Gordon's career, Don Fraser, the former mayor of Minneapolis, former congressman from Minneapolis, served with Gordon in the Senate in the 1950s. And what a great opportunity to have to talk to people like that. Gordon was called the little giant from Little Falls. The public safety department wouldn't give me his driver's license, so I don't know exactly how tall he was, but I don't think he was real tall. But he cast a very large shadow during his 30 years in the Senate. He played a major role in the creation of the State Planning Agency, the Pollution Control Agency, the Metropolitan Council. He led a major reorganization of what's called now called the Department of Natural Resources, and he played a major role in modernizing the Senate. He was the first senator to actually hire professional staff, and by the time he left office, that staff of one lawyer grew to about 8 legislative researchers and lawyers, and it's grown a lot more since then. When Gordon died in 1989, DFL Governor Rudy Perpich said of Rosenmeier, he was a visionary. Among all legislators past and present, Gordon stands out in my mind for 3 reasons. First, he was a product of and a defender of the part-time, nonpartisan citizen legislature. In those days, the legislature only met in the odd-numbered years, and then people went back to their jobs. And so it was possible for legislators to have careers outside of the Capitol, and the state benefited from having them bringing in their real-world advice to the Capitol and pooling their talents. The legislature during most of Gordon's time had very little staff, and legislators often drafted their own bills and then sent them to what's called the revisor's office to polish them up a little. And in those days, legislators were elected without party designation on the ballot, so you didn't see the candidate's name and Republican or Democrat. Legislators caucused under the banners of liberal and conservative. but many of them were not very partisan, and Gordon was very much in that mold. He proudly declared that he had never attended a precinct caucus or a political convention, and that the legislature's great strength was that members didn't have an allegiance to either political party. It made bipartisan compromises a bit easier than it seems to be today. Highly independent, Gordon Rosenmeier showed little deference to governors and other top state officials, regardless of their party. Republican Governor Harold Levander once said, only partly in jest, "I happen to be one of 8 governors who served under Senator Rosenmeier." Another distinguishing feature about Gordon and his career was that he amassed an enormous amount of power. During the 1950s and 60s, he was the leading member of a ruling clique that controlled the Senate and pretty much dominated state government. In the mid and late 60s, he chaired the Senate Judiciary Committee, the Civil Administration Subcommittee on State Departments, the Finance Subcommittee on Higher Education, and what's called the Committee on Committees. That's the committee that decides who will represent the Senate on the joint Senate-House conference committees that work out the final versions of bills. So he was enormously influential. Senator Jack Davies, a DFLer from Minneapolis who served with Gordon for 12 years, told me that Rosenmeier could, quote, get pretty much anything he wanted out of the Senate. Finally, Rosenmeier, a couple of the points about how he amassed his power. He built alliances with other key legislators. As I said, there was this ruling clique. And many of those alliances were formed over late night drinking sessions in the Gopher Grill at the Hotel St. Paul. I remember seeing him there once or twice myself. And I've always thought it was a shame that the remodeled bar in the Hotel St. Paul has what I would call a wall of fame. There's probably about 30 photographs on the wall, and includes a number of people I'm quite sure never entered the St. Paul Grill or the old Gopher Grill. But Gordon's photo was not included, and I once lobbied the manager of the hotel trying to get his photograph on the wall, but I wasn't successful. Finally, Gordon was a different kind of conservative from those who have emerged in the post-Reagan era. He actually believed in government, and he was constantly tinkering with it, trying to make it better. Part of his motivation may have been his concern that the federal government was getting bigger and bigger and encroaching into more areas, and he wanted to see state government remain a strong partner in our federalism system. Former Senator Dave Durenberger, who was Governor Levander's chief of staff, told me Rosenmeier saw initiatives like the State Planning Agency and the PCA as, quote unquote, progressive state alternatives to the expansion of the federal government, with all the strings and rules that come that are attached when the feds get involved. A little bit about Rosenmeier's background, and some of you may know this. He was born in Royalton in 1907, the oldest of 3 children. His father was an attorney, and his mother, Linda, was a school teacher. But they moved to Little Falls after his father was elected Morrison County Attorney in 1912. His father was later elected to the state Senate, serving for 10 years, including several as the Senate Majority Leader. So, like father, like son, I guess. Except Gordon always said that he always wanted to be a lawyer like his father, but that he never had an abiding interest in politics. He did tell of one time visiting his father at the state capitol and encountering the legendary farmer labor governor Floyd B. Olson on the steps of the Capitol. So that must have been a neat experience for him, even if he didn't think he was interested in politics. After high school, he attended the University of Minnesota and then Stanford Law School, graduating in 1932. Well, as he was graduating and coming back to Minnesota, his father became gravely ill and died. And at the urging of some of family friends, Gordon threw his hat into the ring for the Senate in 1932. Well, one of the other candidates for the Senate that year filed a lawsuit challenging his residency because he'd been away at school for the last several years. I think he won that case, but it didn't help him any in the campaign, and he lost. Well, fast forward 8 years to 1940, and he ran again for the state Senate and won easily, and was only challenged once in the next 30 years. He also built a successful law practice in Little Falls and gained a reputation as an extremely effective lawyer and advocate. Former Senator Wayne Popham of Minneapolis, himself an accomplished lawyer, told me that he was co-counsel with Gordon on a case that was being tried in St. Cloud one year. And Wayne told me, the thought occurred to me that going head-to-head against Gordon in a trial would be a real challenge because he didn't do anything halfway. In the Senate, Gordon tended to the needs of his district, which included Morrison and Crow Wing counties, and he played a leading role in expanding Camp Ripley, establishing this college and Brainerd State Hospital, and designating Charles Lindbergh's home as an historic site. But he had a wide range of other interests. One of the more controversial efforts was an effort to cement rural control of the Minnesota Senate into the Constitution. The legislature, in the late 50s, the legislature had not been reapportioned since 1913, and there were huge population disparities among the districts. Gordon and some of his rural colleagues put on the ballot a constitutional amendment that would have allowed the state Senate to be apportioned on the basis of something other than population, like counties. So the Minnesota Senate would have been similar to the U.S. Senate, where you might have had 2 senators from each county rather than on the basis of population. At that time, the string of Supreme Court cases on reapportionment hadn't come down yet. Well, that amendment was on the ballot, I believe, in 1959. Governor Freeman opposed it. The editorial board of the Minneapolis Tribune opposed it. The League of Women Voters opposed it, and it was defeated. Probably not Gordon's finest hour. Over time, Rosenmeier became an increasingly intimidating figure in the Senate. Former Senator Keith Hughes of St. Cloud said it was, quote, like walking the plank when you went before his committee to present a bill. You needed to have the answers. Former Senator Popham said Rosenmeier was equally intimidating on the Senate floor. And he told me about a time when a junior member of their caucus brought a bill of dubious merit to the Senate floor. Now, this is Popham speaking. Gordon got up on the floor and started off by saying something like, "This is the most terrible, disgraceful bill ever to come to the floor of the Minnesota Senate. I cannot imagine how this bill got out of a committee. It's a disgrace to this body." And then Popham continued, "Rosenmeier's bald head was just getting pink. We were just sitting there and everyone was just wishing it would end. I think even the liberals." And Gordon went on for maybe 10 minutes. I think the other members of the body were thinking, I don't ever want this to happen to me. Rosenmeier could be particularly hard on officials of the executive branch of government. And one of the most dramatic examples came in the late 60s when Rosenmeier felt that Governor Levander had exceeded his authority by issuing an executive order reorganizing certain executive branch functions. So he summoned State Administration Commissioner Roland Hatfield to appear before his committee to defend this move. Well, Hatfield was a pretty fiery person in his own right and didn't want to appear before Rosenmeier. So he sent his young assistant, Dick Brubacher, who went on to have a long and distinguished career in state government. Rosenmeier, this was kind of a warm summer day. The state capitol wasn't air conditioned in those days. Rosenmeier started grilling Brubacher about this order, and in the middle of his testimony, Brubacher fainted. He told me that Gordon was one of those who rushed to his side and helped him regain his seat and his composure, and that they became good friends after that. But that's how intimidating Rosenmeier could be. One of his greatest achievements, I think, was the creation of the State Pollution Control Agency in 1967. This came 3 years before Congress created the Federal Environmental Protection Agency. So he was way ahead of his time. From his early days in the Senate, Rosenmeier had a strong interest in issues relating to wetlands, pollution, and water quality. Perhaps it was because he grew up on a home on the banks of the Mississippi River in Little Falls. Perhaps it was because he lived so close to the resort country here in the Brainerd, Baxter area. By the early 60s, the state was confronting some serious environmental problems. Many of the Twin Cities suburbs and some outstate communities were relying on inadequate septic systems to treat their waste, and it was leaching into the groundwater. Other communities were discharging raw or barely treated waste into rivers and lakes, including the Mississippi River, Lake Minnetonka, and other regional water bodies. In addition, in 62, 63, we had several serious oil spills on the Mississippi and Minnesota rivers, killing 10,000 ducks and other wildlife. Rosenmeier was becoming increasingly frustrated with the State Department of Health and its partner agency, the Water Pollution Control Commission, which he felt were not very effective or aggressive. In 63, he passed a bill that increased the Water Pollution Control Commission's powers, including setting pollution standards and the power to order communities to meet those standards. However, he quickly concluded that that body simply was not up to the task. It was made up primarily of commissioners from other state agencies who served on this Water Pollution Control Commission, and I don't know if they were just too timid or what, but they weren't getting the job done in Senator Rosenmeier's view. So in 65, he introduced a bill to create the Pollution Control Agency with a citizens board and a director appointed by the governor. It didn't pass that year, but it did pass 2 years later in 1967. Grant Merritt, who served as the PCA director in the early 70s under DFL Governor Wendell Anderson, got a chance to meet Rosenmeier and came away very impressed. And in Merritt's view, one of the strengths of Rosenmeier's bill was it created the Citizens Policy Committee, which provided a vehicle to air pollution control problems and to build support for solutions. Unfortunately, I think the legislature eliminated that board last session. Rosenmeier's political undoing was an issue that tripped up many a politician over the years, the issue of abortion. In 1969, he granted a hearing in his Judiciary Committee to a bill that would have relaxed the ban on abortion that existed at that time. The bill, this was 3 or 4 years before the Roe v. Wade decision. The bill came out of committee on an 11-9 vote, with Rosenmeier siding with the majority. The bill never advanced any further, but it provided potent ammunition for Rosenmeier's 1970 Senate opponent, a young DFLer named Winston Borden. As I said earlier, Rosenmeier had only been challenged once during his entire 30-year career. And that may not have been the best preparation for the kind of more modern, aggressive campaign that Borden mounted. He also may have been ill prepared for the changing political dynamics of this late 60s. And Steve Wenzel lived through this period and knows it well. Many young people were drawn to politics by the anti-war movement, the civil rights movement, and environmental concerns. And Gordon may not have been in total step with the times at that point. Also in 1968, a gentleman named Louis Philippi, a longtime Rosenmeier supporter, stepped down as chair of the Morrison County DFL. Here, Rosenmeier was perceived by many as a Republican, but one of his biggest supporters is the Morrison County DFL chair. So he lost that support. In that same year, the DFL party elected 2 young House members in both halves of Rosenmeier's Senate district. Rick Nolan, who's just now announcing his second retirement from Congress, and Don Samuelson. Borden, then a 27-year-old attorney, had been preparing to run against Rosenmeier for several years and mounted a very aggressive campaign. I went through Winston Borden's papers at the Historical Society, and I found it included an impressive array of what we call opposition research. They had information about Gordon's record going back multiple years. And so Borden was well armed with ammunition to use against Rosenmeier. And Borden assailed him on a wide range of issues, including abortion, forced fluoridation, taxes, the voting age, and alleged conflicts of interest. And I hadn't seen this in legislative campaigns before at that point, but he had tailored mailings to groups that were concerned about those different issues. So the people who were wound up about fluoridation got a mailing from him on fluoridation. The ones who were concerned about abortion got a mailing on abortion. I'm sure it's probably commonplace in legislative campaigns now, but I think it was it was pretty sophisticated for its day. The final results of that election, Borden won with 12,506 votes to 9,346 for Rosenmeier. In the end, I think Gordon Rosenmeier was simply much more skilled as a legislator and a lawyer than he probably was as a politician. Although I know he had many friends and people who are there's still people around who feel very close to him, have fond memories of him. But on the matter of how he was viewed as a politician or a legislator, 4 times in the late 50s and 60s, the Minneapolis Star conducted a poll of state senators asking who was the most effective senator. All 4 times, Rosenmeier was judged the most effective senator by his peers. Gene Lahammer, who was a longtime Capitol reporter for the Associated Press, wrote an article on the 10 titans of the Minnesota Senate in its history and ranked Gordon number 1. And Robert O'Keefe, who was a longtime seasoned political reporter for the St. Paul and Duluth newspapers, called Rosenmeier one of the 2 best legislators he ever covered. O'Keefe wrote of Rosenmeier, quote, "He can use the English language with the precision of a surgeon's stroke. His scorn unleashed is something to behold." As I wrote in my magazine article, I think Gordon Rosenmeier might feel a little bit out of place in today's highly politicized and fact-free political environment. But he came along at the right time to help modernize the Senate, to modernize state government, to tackle some of the really tough issues that were facing the state at the time, and to better prepare the state to address problems in the future. That's a quick summary of the 5,000 words. I'd be happy to respond to any questions you might have. Oh.
Did Senator Rosenmeier ever have any interest in running for governor?
Not that I'm aware of. I certainly didn't find any evidence of that in his papers. I think he considered governors beneath the Senate. And when I first started covering the Senate in '71, there was still some of that that attitude in that body. I can't speak for the Senate today, but they had a very high opinion of themselves and felt that often they had a better view of things than governors and commissioners.
When he entered the legislature in 1940, who were the most influential state senators and state politicians for him?
Well, that's a good question, and I'm about 4 years away from having done this research, so I didn't write about that, so I don't recall the names, but there were certainly people who had been there for a long time, and I don't think the turnover then was quite as rapid as it became in more recent years. And the legislature was much more dominated by rural members. So there were plenty of role models around. You know, one thing what really changed the legislature, I think, in 1971 and 73. 71, the legislature passed and the voters later approved a constitutional amendment allowing the legislature to meet annually. And that was approved by the voters, and that caused a great exodus of people from the legislature who didn't think they could spend 5 months every year in St. Paul. And a large number of those people who left were some really accomplished lawyers on both sides of the political aisle. And Keith Hughes from St. Cloud was one of them, really talented young guy, but he had a legal career to think about and a family to feed. And there were a lot of people like him, Kelly Gage from Mankato, Bill Doslin from Moorhead, Roy Holston from Minneapolis, lawyer legislators, Harold Kalina, DFLer from Minneapolis, who later became a judge. A lot of legislators didn't think they could continue to serve. The other thing that happened is in '73, after the DFL took control of both houses of the legislature for the first time, they passed the change providing party designation for the legislature. So the party label would appear behind each candidate's name. And that made it harder for conservatives and independents to get elected to the legislature, and it contributed to the heightened partisanship in the legislature.
Out of the 15 boxes of legislative stuff that he had, what was the single most interesting thing that you found?
I'm sorry, I couldn't really.
The most interesting thing you found out of the 15 boxes?
Well, I tried to put the really interesting things in the article, but there were a few things that weren't particularly relevant to the article. One funny story was Gordon had and somebody here probably knows this, had a cabin up here someplace, and he was into, I think, fishing and maybe hunting too. And one time he had a legendary seasoned reporter for WCCO radio up at the cabin with him and maybe a couple other guys, and they were doing some fishing and I think some imbibing of adult beverages. And this reporter fell down the bank at the lake and sprained his ankle or something. So in this oral interview, Gordon said that every time this gentleman had to go to the into the outhouse, Gordon had to put him on the hood of his car and drive him over there. So there was a little bit of color like that was in these boxes, but a fair amount of serious stuff too.
Eric got some exercise there. You said that he reorganized the DNR. How was it before? How did it, act compared to how?
I don't remember a lot of the details about that, but I think the reorganization bill formed these various units that there are now for forestry and fish and wildlife and the like. But I honestly don't remember. The one thing I do remember is that Governor Rolvog was in office at the time, and he had a young aide named Bob Goff, who was later on, he was a very active DFLer and was later on Senator Nick Coleman's advertising partner. And he worked with Senator Rosenmeier on that bill and gained quite a bit of admiration for him, and later served on the Historical Society's Board of Trustees with Senator Rosenmeier. And he became a great, even though he's a very ardent partisan DFLer, he became a great admirer of Senator Rosenmeier, and he was a resource for my article.
How do you think he would have felt about the political climate of today?
About?
The political climate of today, specifically how partisan it is.
Yeah, I think he would be very disappointed. One thing I didn't mention is that he joined with Don Fraser, the DFL senator from Minneapolis, in passing a constitutional amendment to provide for 4-year terms for governors. Up until, the mid-'60s, governors were only elected for 2-year terms, so you can imagine we were constantly having gubernatorial elections, and that was the same was true for the other state constitutional officers. And so Rosenmeier felt that we needed maybe to have a few fewer elections, give the governor a little more time to execute try to achieve his agenda before having the next election. And I think he would have resisted party designation for the legislature. I think he would have resisted annual sessions, and he would have tried to cling to this idea of a part-time citizen legislature where people could reach across the aisle and come to agreement with members of the opposite party. I spent 4 years out in D.C. and 80 to 84, and before that I covered the legislature, and I felt the legislature still functioned fairly well. I went out to Washington, and I watched how almost nothing ever got accomplished. The two sides were always trying to just score political points at the other's expense. I came back from D.C. in 84, and it seemed like the legislature was following Congress's example, and it's only gotten worse in the succeeding years. And why we can't come to agreement on issues without shutting down government or without these bitter partisan fights, I don't understand. It wasn't that way when I first started covering the legislature, and I think I've touched on some of the reasons why. How many of you went to your precinct caucus? All right. This could be an interesting political year. 2 U.S. Senate seats up and the governorship up. I was working for the Minneapolis Tribune in 1978, which is the last time that happened. And if you recall, Wendy Anderson had been popular DFL governor, but he resigned as governor with the understanding that his lieutenant governor, Rudy Perpich, would appoint him to the Senate vacancy. And Rudy, of course, would ascend to the governorship. Enormous political mistake. And it cost the DFL big time. The Republicans swept those elections that year, captured both U.S. Senate seats and the governorship. I don't think the circumstances are exactly the same this time, but you've got an appointed U.S. Senator who's not very well known, Tina Smith, and I don't think Amy Klobuchar is in any difficulty. And then you've got the governorship open, so I think this is going to be a really interesting political year and an awful lot at stake. And it's also will be interesting to see how things play out with Trump and whether that has a positive or a negative effect in Minnesota. I frankly was surprised at how well he did in Minnesota in the last election. It may be that Hillary wasn't that popular a candidate, or it may be that the complexion of the Minnesota electorate is changing. Steve? Sure. Steve is asking about Gordon Rosenmeier's reputation and career as a lawyer and what I could say about that. And unfortunately, not a lot. Since I knew my space for this project was limited, I didn't branch out much into his legal career, except to get the general impression that he was a very well-regarded attorney. I do recall him talking about his early days of his law practice when you couldn't charge very much money for anything, and so I think I mentioned this in my magazine article, but he was lucky if he could charge $5 for a deed or $10 for a will or something like that. So I don't think his early days were all that prosperous, but I think he had some big clients too, like Weyerhaeuser and maybe some of the other timber companies, and so he had a varied practice that included both the farmers and small town business people in this area, and also some bigger corporations. He got criticized because some of what he did involved representing parties in cases involving state government, where somebody was challenging a law or a rule and that sort of thing. And I think Warren Spanis, who was the DFL state chairman in the late 60s, criticized him, and then Winston Borden picked up on that criticism. The thing you have to remember is that the legislature then was a part-time job, and somebody like Gordon, and there were DFLers too, Peter Popovich, who later served on the Supreme Court. They were naturals for parties to go to who knew about the laws and state laws and rulemaking and how they all fit together, and so I think some of that criticism was a little bit unfair, but understandable.
Of his 30 years in the Senate, how many years was he Senate leader? And what do you attribute his tremendous influence? Did people just respect how sharp he was? Or what was the reason he had this stranglehold on power?
Well, he was never Senate Majority Leader. He started out, his first big thing was being chairman of the Civil Administration Committee, which is now called state government or state operations or government operations. And then when he got the Judiciary Committee, he had to give up that assignment, but he was the chairman of the Civil Administration Subcommittee on State Departments. So he had, and then he was on the Finance Committee on Higher Education and the Committee on Committees. So he had a lot of, a lot of power because of his committee chairmanships. Then, as I said, he built these alliances with other key legislators, and he was just a lot smarter than they were. So they took their lead from him. But I think he was also envied a little bit. And I heard one story that I was not able to confirm, but why not share it? There was this. I think this would have been in 1967. John Zwack had been the majority leader and was elected to Congress in the 6th District. And so they had to choose a new majority leader. And I'm told, and the senior senator at that point in time was a very impressive gentleman named Donald Sinclair from the northwestern corner of the state. So they have this caucus at the hotel. Well, no, I think it was at the St. Paul Athletic Club. And I don't. One of the candidates was Senator Holmquist from Grove City, and I believe Gordon was the other candidate or one of the other candidates. So they passed out paper ballots and they voted. And Senator Sinclair looked at them, tabulated them, and stuck them in his pocket and said, "Senator Holmquist has been elected." So whether he was really elected or not, we don't know. But nobody was in a position to challenge Senator Sinclair. And so that election prevailed. So, Gordon's father, Christian, had been the Senate Majority Leader, but Gordon never achieved that position.
Steve, we talk about Gordon's power, and it seems though that no matter who is that person in power, there's always an adversary out there that is either challenging him or is creating a kind of a craw on his side. Through all your research, were you ever able to uncover that individual that may have tested Gordon or challenged him or gave him a few less hairs?
Well, there were other people who were more senior. Senator Davies was a law professor and from Minneapolis, a DFLer, and was pretty sharp and probably a pretty good debater. But I think the up-and-comer at that time was Senator Nick Coleman from St. Paul, and the father now of Chris Coleman, the gubernatorial candidate. Nick was just a very clever guy and very articulate and had a wicked sense of humor. And I'm sure they had some interesting debates. That was a little bit before my time, but I covered Nick throughout the 70s. And Nick was a big admirer of Senator Rosenmeier. And I think it was in 1974, they had a big, maybe 72 or 74, somewhere in there. They had a big party for Rosenmeier to kind of honor, in Little Falls, to honor his years of service. And Nick was among the speakers, and he passed a Senate resolution praising Gordon's contributions through his career. So I think they were frenemies.
I heard a rumor, I guess you'd call it, one time that this college could have either been in Little Falls or in Brainerd, that it ended in Brainerd because that's what Gordon decided. Do you come across anything about that in your research?
I did not, but the president here, I think, was talking about that. We had dinner beforehand, Steve, do you know the answer to that question?
They were against it. And Gordon, I think Gordon's the one that told me that. Because I said, Gordon, the rumors I hear about you, I told this to Gordon in 1970, is that you do everything for Brainerd and nothing for Little Falls. And he said, Steve, he said, it's up to the people of Little Falls and the city council to make that decision. And he said, and I followed their recommendations, and that makes sense. And he's long passed away, and bless him, but L.B. Odette was the old-time city council president, and he seemed to object to a lot of things coming into Little Falls at that particular time. And then Sally wants to add to that.
There already were in the state junior colleges throughout the state, and they were being run mostly by the high schools. And there was one in Brainerd, and there was not one in Little Falls. And it had been here since 1938. So I think that would have a lot to do with it too. And the school districts had to initiate this.
I was always told it was the Staples campus or the Staples College that was supposed to be in Little Falls. At least that's what I remember hearing growing up.
Well, community colleges and nursing homes are both very popular in outside communities, and everybody wants one.
He served over or under a lot of interesting politicians who were governor, such as Harold Stassen, Luther Youngdahl, Orville Freeman, and Harold Levander, who come to mind because they were also known as great attorneys. And I was wondering if he had anything, and aside from those gentlemen as well, was there anything in there about particular governors or a governor he really liked working at or really? It seems to me he was pretty even-handed about who he took on and who he didn't take on. I just wonder if there was anything particular about any particular governors that he had great affection for, great respect for, compared to the others.
Yeah, I think that's right. He liked Rovog, and I think he liked Stassen. He did not get along very well with Orville Freeman, and I think in about 57, my memory's a little hazy on this now, that was the one time that there was a semi-serious challenge of Gordon, and electoral challenge, and Freeman, I think, played a major role in that and was unsuccessful. I think Gordon had a minimum of high regard for Harold Levander. It's more I never quite understood the relationship with Rovog, where that came from. They both were fond of adult beverages. That could have been part of it. But Bob Goff established, on Rovog's behalf, established a pretty good relationship with Rosenmeier, and that might have been part of it too. Wendy Anderson was just a young state senator when Rosenmeier was kind of concluding his career. I don't think they were abundantly close, although he came up to Little Falls for that party or celebration for Gordon as well.
We want to thank everybody for coming tonight. We'll give him a nice warm applause.
Thanks very much.
He's going to stick around for a little bit, so if you have other questions you want to ask, feel free to come on up. Otherwise, thank you very much. Appreciate it.